This story is a work of historical fiction, inspired by grim legends and folklore from the American frontier. While certain historical details, such as the setting in Arizona during 1876, are accurate, the characters and events are fictionalized for dramatic and horror storytelling purposes. The narrative contains psychological tension, violence, and macabre themes intended only for mature audiences who enjoy dark historical fiction. It should not be taken as a factual record or encouragement of violence. The story of Clara and Thomas Hensley was, at first glance, no different from countless other marriages that formed along the frontier. They had been wed in haste, as many were during those years of turmoil and constant migration. Some said they married for love, others whispered it was out of necessity. Whatever the truth, their union was carried westward into the dust and unforgiving heat of Arizona, where the harsh landscape had a way of exposing every weakness between husband and wife. Thomas Hensley was a man of the old stock, stoic, weather-beaten, and practical. Born in Kentucky, he grew up among farmers and soldiers, men who believed in strength above tenderness. He carried those lessons westward, hardened further by lean years of war and work. To him, marriage was a partnership forged out of survival. The husband provided, the wife managed the household. There was little space for romance in his mind. And yet, when Clara entered his life, Thomas had been captivated by her striking presence. Clara, however, was an enigma. She carried herself with the air of someone unaccustomed to labor. Her slender hands, though she tried to conceal them, betrayed her lack of experience with work. And her speech, measured, deliberate, often touched with phrases that seemed rehearsed, did not resemble the rough, colloquial manner of the frontier women in Red Rock. Some whispered that she had been educated, perhaps even of gentle breeding. But how she ended up the wife of Thomas Hensley was a mystery no one could unravel. The townsfolk quickly noticed that theirs was not a harmonious marriage. When the Hensleys first appeared at Sunday service, Clara in a faded but carefully mended dress, Thomas in his dusty boots and stiff collar, they seemed ill-matched. Clara did not smile or exchange pleasantries with the other wives. She kept her gaze lowered or fixed on some invisible point, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. When Thomas greeted acquaintances, his voice was firm, even jovial, but Clara's silence stood out like a thorn among blossoms. At first, people excused her strangeness. They reasoned that the Arizona Territory was a lonely and unsettling place for a woman unaccustomed to it. Perhaps she missed her family back east. Perhaps she was shy. But as the months passed, a darker picture began to emerge. Neighbors recalled the evenings when the Hensleys' voices carried across the still desert air. Arguments erupted in their small homestead, Clara's sharp tones clashing with Thomas's thunderous replies. Some swore they heard the crash of objects thrown against walls, the slam of doors, and once, a shrill scream that silenced the coyotes for miles. Yet the next day, when Thomas appeared in town, he acted as though nothing had happened. If his jaw was bruised or his knuckles bloodied, he claimed it was the result of hard work or a scuffle in the saloon. But Clara's face told another story. She appeared pale and drawn, her eyes ringed with dark circles. When spoken to, she answered curtly, sometimes with a brittle laugh that unsettled those around her. It was as though the desert had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell of a woman, one that rattled with secrets. Thomas believed in discipline, and some suggested he extended that belief into his marriage. He expected obedience, meals on time, and silence when he spoke. Yet Clara was not the kind of woman to bow easily. She was sharp-tongued, clever, and proud. In another time, in another place, she might have thrived as a woman of independent means. But in Red Rock, in the confines of her small house, her spirit clashed violently against Thomas's authority. The cracks in their marriage widened. Clara was seen wandering alone into the desert at twilight, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her figure stark against the dying sun. She collected wild plants, roots, and herbs, items the local women avoided, calling them witch plants. When asked what she did with them, Clara replied coolly that she brewed teas for her health. Yet whispers spread, perhaps she was preparing potions, charms, or something darker. Thomas, meanwhile, drank heavily in town, On more than one occasion, he confided to fellow ranchers that Clara was unnatural. He said she looked at him in ways that made his blood run cold, that she muttered strange words in her sleep. He even joked once, though his eyes did not smile, that if he woke one night to find her standing over him with a knife, he would not be surprised. What bound them together, then, if their union was so poisoned? Some said it was need. Thomas required a wife to manage his household, and Clara needed a protector in a land where widows and unmarried women struggled to survive. Others believed there was more, that Clara married not for love or safety, but for something else entirely. There was a hunger in her, they said, a hunger that Thomas's presence could not satisfy. As the summer of 1876 deepened, the tension in the Hensley household became unbearable. Neighbors saw less and less of Clara, and when she did appear, her eyes seemed haunted, as though she were carrying a great burden. Some noticed bruises on her arms, faint marks that suggested rough handling. Yet others claimed it was Clara who looked capable of violence, that behind her silence lurked a simmering rage. The marriage of Clara and Thomas Hensley was no mere domestic struggle. It was a battle of wills, fought in the isolation of the desert, far from the watchful eyes of society. And like many such battles, it could only end in tragedy. For in that parched land, under the burning Arizona sun, something was festering within the walls of the Hensley home. The arguments, the secrets, the strange herbs, and the cold glances were all signs pointing toward an inevitable conclusion. A storm was coming, not one of rain or wind, but of blood. And when it broke, Red Rock would never forget the name Clara Hensley. By the time the summer of 1876 settled over Red Rock, Clara Hensley had become a figure of speculation and fear. In a town where everyone knew one another's business, Clara's odd habits gave rise to whispered tales that spread from the saloon to the church pews. What set her apart was not merely her silence or her beauty, but the sense that she was touched by something beyond the ordinary, a presence, an obsession, or perhaps a curse. The desert seemed to call to her. While other women remained close to their homes, wary of heatstroke, snakes, or Apache raiding parties, Clara wandered the arid landscape as though she belonged to it. She was often seen at dawn or dusk, when the sky flared with red fire or deepened into violet shadow. Wrapped in her shawl, she walked among the mesquite and sage, stopping to dig at the dry soil or gather plants in small pouches. Locals began to murmur. One ranch hand, a superstitious man from Mexico, swore he saw her kneeling at a dry wash, speaking in a low voice to no one visible. He claimed she was whispering to the earth itself, and that when he drew closer, the air turned unnaturally cold despite the blazing sun. Others dismissed his story as drink-induced nonsense, but it found eager ears in a town already on edge from drought and scarcity. The more observant townsfolk noticed that Clara's forays into the desert coincided with strange occurrences. Chickens belonging to a nearby farmer were found mutilated, their bodies arranged in peculiar patterns. A prospector swore he lost a sack of jerky, only to find scraps of it days later near the Hensley homestead, reeking of herbs. Even Thomas himself, red-faced and drunk one evening, told companions that his wife played at witchcraft, and that he often woke to find her sitting rigid in the dark, staring at him with unblinking eyes. Yet there was more to Clara's restlessness than superstition. Beneath her strange behavior lay an undeniable despair. Marriage to Thomas had crushed what little warmth she carried westward. She felt herself withering inside the small clapboard house, surrounded by dust and silence. The harshness of frontier life demanded a certain resilience, but Clara's discontent grew into something more dangerous. She was not content merely to endure, she longed for control, for liberation from the yoke of a husband she neither loved nor respected. Her walks into the desert became acts of defiance, a way to escape Thomas's watchful presence. The desert, barren to most, offered Clara a kind of companionship. She listened to the wind sighing through canyons, to the distant cries of coyotes, to the crackle of dry brush underfoot. She said once, to a neighbor who dared ask why she walked so far, "The desert speaks more kindly than people." This remark unsettled the town. Words spread, exaggerated with each retelling, until some swore Clara claimed to hear voices on the wind. Children were warned not to stare at her, lest she cast a curse. The preacher, Reverend Mather, made pointed references in his sermons to Eve's disobedience and the dangers of women who stray from their appointed duties. Everyone knew who he meant. Clara herself seemed unmoved by the gossip. If anything, she grew bolder. She began experimenting with the herbs she collected, drying them in the sun, grinding them into powders, and mixing them into broths. The smells drifting from the Hensley home were unlike any ordinary cooking, pungent, sharp, with undertones that made neighbors wrinkle their noses. When asked what she brewed, Clara replied curtly, "Medicine." Yet no one ever saw her offer it to the sick. Her relationship with Thomas worsened. He was a proud man, and the gossip about his wife gnawed at him. He accused her of shaming him, of behaving like a madwoman. Their fights grew violent, and once Clara appeared in town with a gash along her temple. She claimed she tripped, but her eyes told another story. Some pitied her, others judged her. Still, the whispers grew louder. Perhaps Clara was not only restless, but dangerous. One chilling account came from a young boy who tended goats near the Hensley land. He swore he saw Clara at dusk, crouched near a shallow grave. She appeared to be burying something, though he couldn't see what. When she rose, she turned her head sharply, as if sensing him. He ran home in terror, claiming her eyes glowed in the fading light. By late summer, even the sheriff admitted unease. Sheriff Callahan was not a man given to superstition, but he heard enough reports to ride out to the Hensley homestead. He found Clara alone, seated calmly on the porch with her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders despite the heat. When he asked after Thomas, she said simply, "He's gone hunting." Her tone was flat, final, as though discouraging further questions. Callahan rode away unsettled. Something about her presence lingered with him, a sense of stillness too profound, like standing at the edge of a pit. Red Rock was a place accustomed to violence. Men shot each other in card games, outlaws raided stagecoaches, and disease claimed the weak. But Clara's growing estrangement from her husband and her eerie desert wandering stirred a different kind of fear. It was not the fear of bullets or knives, but of the unknown, the feeling that something unnatural was seeping quietly into their midst. And within Clara, the restlessness festered. Each argument with Thomas, each whispered insult from the townsfolk, each lonely night staring into the desert sky, sharpened her resolve. Her marriage was a prison, her life a cage. She had been brought westward under the promise of security, but found only dust, drudgery, and the heavy hand of a man she did not love. She began to imagine an escape. At first, it was fleeting, a thought in the dead of night, a vision during her desert walks. But the thought returned again and again, stronger each time, until it was no longer a fantasy but a plan. For Clara Hensley was no longer content to endure. Her restlessness was turning into something darker, something that would soon erupt into an act that would brand her forever in the memory of the Arizona Territory. By the end of 1876, Red Rock had grown accustomed to trouble, but what went on inside the Hensley home became the talk of the settlement. Thomas and Clara's marriage, already fragile, was descending into open warfare. What had begun as tense silences and sharp words escalated into something more volatile, and soon even the walls of their clapboard home could not contain the noise. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting that carried on late into the night, Thomas's booming, slurred voice and Clara's sharp, cutting retorts. It was no secret that Thomas had a temper worsened by drink. He often returned from the saloon with whiskey on his breath, his face flushed, ready to unleash his frustration on the woman who waited at home. But Clara was no meek frontier wife. She met his fury with a coldness that enraged him further. Where other women might plead or submit, Clara stood her ground, her eyes fixed on him with a defiance that cut deeper than any words. The violence began in small ways, a shove against the wall, a bruise on her arm, a door slammed so hard the hinges cracked. But as weeks passed, it grew uglier. Thomas struck her openly now. Once he dragged her into the yard by her hair, shouting about her witches' tricks. As the neighbors looked on, torn between pity and fear. Clara did not scream, even then. She stood silently after, dusting herself off, her eyes burning not with tears but with something darker, resolve. People in town began to whisper that Clara was cursed, or perhaps cursed Thomas himself. After such humiliations, any ordinary woman might have fled or begged for help, but Clara did neither. She carried her bruises in silence, and walked the desert paths the next morning as though nothing had happened. It was as if she fed on her suffering, storing it, shaping it into a weapon yet to be revealed. Reverend Mather visited her once, carrying his Bible. He urged her to pray, to repent for her defiant spirit, and to be a more dutiful wife. Clara listened in silence, her face blank, until at last she said, "If you knew what went on behind those walls, Reverend, you'd pray for me instead." The words unsettled him so deeply that he left without offering another verse. The strain of the marriage began to seep into Thomas's work. He grew reckless with his livestock, careless with his accounts at the general store. The saloon keeper, old Macready, confided to a friend that Thomas muttered of his wife's unnatural ways, insisting she poisoned his food or whispered curses into his sleep. Whether these were paranoid delusions or drunken inventions, they spread quickly in Red Rock, feeding the town's unease. Yet, as much as Thomas railed against his wife, he could not bear to let her go. Divorce was rare in the territory, and his pride as a man would not allow it. Instead, he tightened his grip, determined to break her spirit. He restricted her movements, threatened her when she lingered too long in the desert, and once even locked her inside the house for 3 days. When she finally emerged, gaunt and pale, her neighbors noticed something chilling. She looked not broken, but reborn. Her eyes carried a new intensity, her silence more unnerving than before. Whatever Thomas had hoped to accomplish, it had failed. Clara was no longer a woman simply enduring violence, she was calculating something. The breaking point came one autumn evening. A cool wind had swept through Red Rock, and most families were indoors. From the Hensley house came the unmistakable sounds of struggle, furniture overturned, glass shattering, Thomas's voice rising in a drunken roar. Several neighbors later testified they heard a scream, sharp and piercing, unlike any before. Then came silence. Thomas stumbled into town the next morning with a bandage on his hand and a cut across his cheek. He claimed Clara had attacked him with a kitchen knife after he caught her in one of her spells. He laughed it off at the saloon, calling her a wildcat in skirts, but the look in his eyes betrayed unease. For the first time, Thomas appeared afraid of his wife. The story spread quickly. Women whispered that Clara had finally fought back. Men muttered that she was dangerous, unpredictable. But what struck everyone most was Thomas's behavior in the following weeks. He grew quieter, less boastful, drinking more heavily than before. He began carrying his revolver inside the house, a detail that did not go unnoticed. It seemed the balance of power in the marriage was shifting, though in what direction, no one could yet say. Clara, meanwhile, became more secretive. Her desert wanderings continued, but now she carried satchels filled with roots, dried herbs, and stones. She spent long hours by the hearth, stirring pots of broth that filled the air with acrid fumes. The townsfolk avoided her, crossing the street when she walked past. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Clara seemed to move through Red Rock like a ghost, her pale face framed by dark hair, her eyes fixed on something unseen. Behind closed doors, the violence did not stop. Thomas's paranoia grew sharper. He accused Clara of poisoning his whiskey, of slipping powders into his food. He tested his meals by feeding scraps to the dogs first, and when one grew ill, his suspicions deepened. Their fights became daily, their home a battleground. It was around this time that the young boy with goats claimed to see Clara burying something near the creek, a bundle wrapped in cloth. When asked, Clara said nothing. Days later, Thomas was seen limping into town with a swollen jaw and bruises. He claimed he'd fallen from a horse, but no one believed him. The Hensley marriage had become more than a private tragedy. It was a spectacle, a dark tale that the town watched with horrified fascination. Each outburst, each bruise, each whispered rumor drew Red Rock closer to the edge of scandal and fear. And yet, beneath all the violence, Clara's restlessness was coalescing into something sharper. Every strike she endured, every insult she swallowed, every humiliation she suffered seemed to harden her will. She had once dreamed of escape, but now she dreamed of something else: finality. For Clara Hensley no longer saw her husband as a man. She saw him as an obstacle. And obstacles on the frontier were meant to be removed. The people of Red Rock believed they had seen every kind of brutality that the frontier could offer: gunfights in the streets, drunken brawls in the saloon, horse thieves swinging from makeshift gallows. Yet what began to unfold inside the Hensley home was unlike anything the desert town had ever witnessed. Clara had endured years of Thomas's violence. Bruises faded, but scars of humiliation did not. His words had bitten deeper than his fists. His sneering face as he dragged her by the hair through the dirt, his mocking laughter when he struck her in front of neighbors, his drunken boasts about taming his wildcat wife, all of it festered in her mind like an infection. Slowly, her anger became more than anger, it became intent. Thomas's growing paranoia gave her the opportunity she needed. He had convinced himself that she was poisoning him already, and in a strange way, that belief gave her room to maneuver. If she cooked his meals carefully, if she fed him without hesitation, he began to relax, until his suspicion returned again. This cycle made him careless, vulnerable. And Clara was patient. Her plan was not conceived in a single night. It grew over weeks, each argument, each violent outburst sharpening its edges. At first, the thought terrified her. She had once been a girl who dreamed of open skies and freedom, not blood. But now, staring at her husband across the table, watching him gulp whiskey like water and slam his fist on the wood when his stew was too thin, she began to imagine his absence. In the desert, she began collecting more than roots and herbs. She gathered wild sage and mesquite, not just for medicine but for masking scents. She saved ashes from the hearth and studied the butchering of goats, with a chilling new focus. Life on the frontier was brutal, but it also taught practical skills that could be twisted into darker purposes. The breaking point came one night when Thomas returned from the saloon more drunk than usual. He accused her of selling herself to other men while he was gone, calling her a whore in a widow's dress. When she denied it, he struck her so hard she collapsed against the hearth, her lips split and bleeding. As she looked up at him, his shadow towering over her in the firelight, she realized she would never survive if he lived. Something cold and certain snapped into place inside her. After that night, Clara began rehearsing. She moved silently through the house when Thomas was gone, practicing how to handle the cleaver without noise, how to boil water without steam escaping too quickly, how to carve without hesitation. Her mind, once filled with fear, became a map of possibilities. She also understood the importance of timing. If Thomas disappeared suddenly, suspicion would fall on her immediately. But if his death looked like an accident, or better yet, if his body disappeared altogether, she might escape blame. Red Rock was a town that thrived on rumor but had little law to back it. Sheriff Malloy was a lazy man, more interested in cards and whiskey than justice. If Clara was clever, she could erase Thomas Hensley from the world. Her plan solidified over a series of nights. She would strike him when he was most vulnerable, after drink, when his senses dulled and his balance faltered. She would not use poison, though it was tempting. Poison left traces, and whispers of witchcraft were already attached to her name. No, her act would be blunt, final, and bloody. The cleaver, heavy and sharp, would serve her better than any powder. But what then? Killing a man was only the first step. Disposing of his body was another matter entirely. A shallow grave in the desert would be uncovered by coyotes. Dumping him in the river risked discovery downstream. Clara's solution came from the most ordinary source, the kitchen. She had prepared countless meals for Thomas, carving meat from goats and chickens. Flesh was flesh. Bone was bone. If she could cut and cook what she killed on the homestead, she could do the same to Thomas. The thought horrified her at first, but the more she considered it, the more it seemed like the only way. Cooking his flesh would destroy the evidence, feed the illusion of normalcy. And if anyone asked where Thomas had gone, she would say he'd ridden off on a drunken spree, as he had many times before. In Red Rock, men vanished into the desert with regularity. Who would question another disappearance? Clara began to prepare the house in subtle ways. She sharpened the cleaver daily, though she claimed it was for butchering goats. She stocked extra firewood, explaining to neighbors that the desert nights were colder now. She scrubbed her pots until they gleamed, as though anticipating a feast. And always, she waited for Thomas's rages, knowing the perfect night would come soon. Her demeanor in public grew colder, more distant. Where once she had exchanged curt greetings with neighbors, she now said nothing at all. She walked through town like a shadow, her dark eyes unreadable. People whispered more than ever, but Clara paid them no mind. She was focused on her goal, her silence concealing a storm. Thomas himself remained oblivious, too consumed by his drink and his paranoia to see what was coming. He joked at the saloon that his wife would kill him one day, then laughed so hard he spilled his whiskey down his shirt. No one laughed with him. A few men shifted uncomfortably, wondering if the joke was closer to truth than he realized. The night Clara chose was moonless, the sky heavy with clouds. Thomas had been drinking since noon, stumbling into the house long after dark. He shouted for his supper, slamming his revolver on the table as though daring her to defy him. She placed the plate in front of him without a word, her hands steady, her face calm. He ate greedily, spilling broth down his chin, then demanded more whiskey. She poured it for him, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. As he lifted the glass, Clara reached for the cleaver. The firelight glinted off its blade as she raised it high. For a moment, time seemed to stop. She saw every bruise he had given her, every insult, every moment of shame and fear. And then, with a force born not of rage but of certainty, she brought the blade down. The sound was wet, final. Thomas Hensley's head slumped forward, his hand twitching once before falling still. Blood pooled across the table, spreading toward her as though reaching out. Clara did not move. She stood in the silence, breathing steadily, her grip firm on the cleaver. It was done. But the plan was only halfway complete. Now came the part that would either save her or condemn her, the disposal. Clara dragged Thomas's body from the chair, her strength fueled by grim determination. She set water to boil, the flames crackling louder than ever, and prepared the kitchen for its most terrible task. The convent of horrors had been whispered about in Red Rock. But soon, the town would whisper about something far darker, the wife who cooked her husband for supper. And Clara Hensley, calm and unflinching, would make sure those whispers never touched her with proof. The desert night pressed heavy against the windows of the Hensley house, but inside, the kitchen was alive with fire and steam. Clara worked methodically, her bloodied dress replaced by a clean one, her dark hair pulled back from her face. Her hands, steady as stone, moved with a precision that frightened even herself. Thomas's body lay on the table, the lifeless shell of a man who had once filled the house with rage and cruelty. Now, he was nothing more than meat. Clara did not cry, nor did she falter. She approached her grim task as though she had been preparing for it all her life. With practiced skill, she cut the body into pieces. The sound of the cleaver striking bone echoed in the room, sharp and final. She set aside what she could use, sections of meat that could be boiled, roasted, or ground into stews. The rest she burned in the fire or buried under layers of ash and sage to mask the smell. The desert was unforgiving, but it was also a silent accomplice. Coyotes and vultures would take care of what little remained. By dawn, the Hensley house smelled not of blood but of roasting meat and herbs. Anyone passing by might have thought Clara was preparing a feast for visiting relatives. The irony was not lost on her. The opportunity to cover her crime came swiftly. 2 days after Thomas's death, her sister-in-law, Margaret, arrived at the house with her 3 children. They had come to ask about Thomas, who had not been seen in town. Clara welcomed them with calm warmth, her face betraying nothing. "He's gone off again," she explained. Took the horse out after a row. You know how he was. Margaret sighed, half exasperated, half relieved. That man will drink himself to death one day. Clara smiled thinly. Maybe he already has. That night, Clara prepared supper for the family. The children sat wide-eyed at the table, chattering, while Margaret praised Clara's cooking. The stew was rich, the meat tender, the broth thick with herbs and vegetables. It's the best I've tasted in months, Margaret declared, spooning more into her bowl. Clara sat opposite them, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes watchful as they ate. Each bite erased evidence, each mouthful carried Thomas further into oblivion. It was not triumph she felt, nor horror, it was something colder, emptier. As though she had shed the last tether of her humanity, and found a strange peace in its absence. For 3 days, Margaret and her children remained at the house, eating from the pot Clara kept on the fire. When they left, full and unsuspecting, Clara watched them disappear down the dusty road with an expression unreadable to anyone but herself. They had unknowingly carried her secret within their bellies, made themselves unwilling accomplices in her crime. In town, whispers of Thomas's absence grew. Some said he'd finally drunk himself into the desert. Others believed he'd run off with a saloon girl. Sheriff Malloy asked a few questions, but Clara's calm explanations, paired with her reputation for Thomas's mistreatment, were enough to silence deeper inquiry. Reckon he'll turn up or he won't, the sheriff muttered, already pouring another drink. The feast had done more than feed mouths, it had bought Clara time. By feeding Thomas to his kin, she had ensured no one would ever search for him. Who would suspect the grieving wife who opened her home, who shared her meals, who waited patiently for her husband to return? But Clara knew the truth. The house no longer echoed with Thomas's voice, no longer shook with his rage. Only the silence remained. And in that silence, Clara found not freedom, but a deeper haunting. Every night, as she lay awake, she swore she could still hear the cleaver striking bone, smell the iron tang of blood mingling with herbs. Her plan had worked. Her husband was gone. Red Rock suspected nothing. And yet Clara Hensley discovered that some ghosts do not leave when the body is gone. Sometimes they sit across from you at supper. For a time, Clara believed she had succeeded. Thomas was gone, the neighbors unsuspecting, and her life was quieter than it had ever been. She walked the town with her head high, no longer flinching at every noise or drunken shout. Yet freedom, she soon discovered, was not peace. Red Rock was a place where silence bred rumors faster than truth. Weeks passed, and still no one saw Thomas. At first, townsfolk shrugged it off. Men disappeared often, chasing gold or running from debt. But gradually, questions sharpened. Why had Clara not reported his absence? Why did she seem so calm? The whispers began in the saloon, carried by whiskey and suspicion. She cooked him. One man muttered, laughing nervously. Another replied, wouldn't put it past her. That woman's got the devil in her eyes. Soon the children of Red Rock played cruel games, pretending to be Clara at a pot, stirring enchanting spells. Mother scolded them, but the stories spread anyway. The Reverend preached a sermon about Jezebel, about wicked women who led men to ruin. He never named Clara, but the congregation knew who he meant. Afterwards, several women crossed themselves when she walked by, while others avoided her altogether. Margaret, Thomas's sister, began to visit less often. She claimed the walk was too long, the children restless, but Clara noticed the hesitation in her eyes. One afternoon, Margaret whispered, Clara, tell me the truth. Did he hurt you worse than we knew? Clara only smiled and replied, You'll never know how much. The answer, instead of soothing, deepened Margaret's unease. The sheriff, too, returned with questions. He leaned on her porch rail, hat in hand, his words slow. Thomas was no saint, I'll grant you that. But a man don't just vanish without a trace. Clara met his gaze steadily, saying only, If he did, maybe the world's better for it. Sheriff Malloy chuckled, but later admitted in town, That woman's too calm for her own good. And then there were the animals. Coyotes gathered more often near her homestead, howling at night, their eyes reflecting firelight. Some swore they smelled strange smoke on the wind, meat and herbs mingled with something else, something foul. Hunters passing through said the earth near her house was unsettled, as if something had been buried shallow and disturbed again. Fear began to curl around Clara like smoke. Though she showed no cracks in public, at night she paced the house, certain that Thomas's ghost lingered. In the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the fire, even the bubbling of the stew, she heard him. His presence weighed heavier than his fists ever had. Red Rock no longer saw Clara as a victim. They saw her as an omen. A widow, yes, but one whose silence and dark eyes hinted at unspoken horrors. The town's superstition had turned against her, and Clara realized the most dangerous part of her plan was not the killing, nor the cooking. It was living with the secret in a place where secrets never stayed buried. Winter came early to Red Rock in 1877. A cold wind swept through the desert, carrying with it the weight of rumors that no fire could burn away. Clara Hensley lived alone in her house on the edge of town, but she was never truly alone. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow seemed to carry Thomas's voice. At first, she thought it was guilt. But soon, it grew sharper, more insistent. When she stirred the pot on the hearth, she swore she saw his reflection in the broth, his sneering grin bubbling to the surface. At night, she heard his boots pacing across the floorboards, though no one walked there. Once, she woke to the heavy press of a hand on her throat, only to find herself gasping in the empty dark. Her neighbors kept their distance. Children dared each other to run up to her porch and knock before fleeing in terror. Men at the saloon muttered that Thomas had cursed her in death, binding her soul to his. Margaret never came again, unable to look at the woman who had fed her so generously weeks before. The sheriff made one last visit. He sat at her table, hat in his lap, eyes wary. "People are talking, Clara. They say you know where Thomas went. They say you made him disappear." Clara poured him coffee with a steady hand, her voice calm. "If I had, Sheriff, would you really want to know the truth?" The silence that followed chilled him more than any confession. He left, never to return. The line between reality and madness thinned for Clara. She burned sage to chase away spirits, but the smoke only filled the house with the smell of charred meat. She avoided the kitchen, yet hunger always drew her back to the hearth where she had destroyed Thomas piece by piece. She dreamed of knives, of blood hissing in boiling water, of her husband's voice whispering that she would never be rid of him. One bitter night, neighbors saw a strange glow from the Hensley house. By morning, only charred beams and ash remained. No body was ever found, either Clara's nor Thomas's. Some said she had set the fire herself, consumed by guilt and visions. Others claimed Thomas's spirit had finally taken her with him. A few swore they saw her walking into the desert just before dawn, her figure vanishing into the endless red horizon. Red Rock carried the story for generations. Parents warned their children never to wander near the ruins of the Hensley place, where coyotes still howled and smoke sometimes rose on windless nights. They called her the wife who cooked her husband, the woman whose hunger for freedom turned into something darker. And whether she burned with her house, fled into the desert, or still walked among them, one thing was certain: Clara Hensley's name would forever haunt the Arizona territory. She had silenced Thomas Hensley, but in doing so, she had written her own legend of horror. Years passed, and the Hensley homestead became nothing more than a weathered ruin. The desert wind carved away at the boards, leaving splintered beams jutting toward the sky. Travelers occasionally paused to mark the place with a silent nod or hurried past, shivering at the stories whispered by locals. The legend of Clara Hensley persisted, told in hushed tones around fireplaces and at the saloon bar. Some claimed the desert itself remembered her. Coyotes circled the ruins with unusual caution, their howls echoing like warning cries. Hunters passing by spoke of fleeting shadows that moved with human intent, a pale figure glimpsed at twilight, disappearing before the eye could focus. It was said to be Clara, forever wandering, her restless spirit bound to the land she had both loved and destroyed. The townsfolk rarely ventured near, yet curiosity always gnawed at newcomers. One evening, a wandering prospector approached the house, fascinated by the tales. He reported that the ash from the burned hearth seemed to form strange patterns, lines and spirals that no ordinary fire could produce. Some locals interpreted them as messages, a warning or a curse. Others whispered that it was Clara's way of reaching beyond death, ensuring that her story would never be forgotten. Odd occurrences became almost ritualistic. Livestock occasionally went missing near the ruins, only to be discovered days later in grotesque arrangements, eerily reminiscent of the strange patterns Clara had once practiced in her home. Travelers reported a lingering smell, faint but unmistakably metallic, that hung around the property despite decades of exposure to rain and sun. Yet some dared a different interpretation. Clara had not merely been a murderer, she had been a woman constrained by a violent marriage, surviving in the only way she knew. The horror of her acts was undeniable, but so was the suffering she endured. In hushed tones, some wondered whether she had found freedom in the desert, shedding not just the body of Thomas Hensley but also the expectations and oppression of an unforgiving world. Red Rock slowly changed, townsfolk aging, children growing into adults, and newcomers bringing different lives. But the story of Clara Hensley remained. It was told not as history alone but as a caution, about isolation, about unchecked violence, about the fine line between survival and monstrosity. Every winter, when the wind cut across the desert with bitter precision, someone would swear they heard the creak of floorboards, the faint clatter of a cleaver, or the whisper of a woman's voice carried on the cold gust. And so the tale endures. Clara Hensley may have vanished from the living, but she never disappeared from memory. The ruins, the smoke-scented wind, the eerie glow at night, all serve as proof that some deeds leave marks beyond the reach of time. In the desert, under the unyielding sun and the vast night sky, the echoes of Red Rock tell a story of violence, cunning, and the haunting consequence of unchecked restlessness. The desert remembers. And those who listen closely can still hear the whispers of Clara Hensley. Ch. 4.